thanks for joining. Today we're going to go through a series of exercises, mostly for hip health, mostly restorative and on the mat, but we'll bring it up to stand at the end. So please join me with some pillows and a yoga block, which will act as a pillow inside lying towards the middle. All right, so setting up our props and coming to lie down on the mat in a way that suits you best. A little bit of head support for comfort. Arms long at your sides. And we're going to start with about 10 breaths. Breathing softly in through the nose and softly out through the mouth. So let that inhale come in effortlessly, and that exhale moves out effortlessly. As you inhale and exhale with no effort, emphasize settling into your mat at the pelvis. So allow your pelvis to feel really heavy, really connected to the mat. And then moving up the chain, allow your ribs to feel very settled, very connected to the mat. See if with every breath cycle you can get a little bit heavier. Create a little more contact with the back of your pelvis and the back of your ribs. Scanning your chest and neck, and can the breath soften through chest and neck, allowing these areas to widen and feel open and soft. And then allow your jaw to relax. No tension through the lips. And then allow your eyes to relax. Thinking about the eyes getting softer in the sockets. Relaxing any tension all around your eyes. Making sure that that breath is full of ease when air comes into the body on your inhale. And that exhale is full of ease when the air comes out of your body on the exhale. We'll rely on that easeful breath throughout today's class, and then find our hip points or ASISs using a fingertip touch, and start to rock those hip points towards our ribs, rolling the pelvis back, and rock those hip points away from ribs, rolling the pelvis forward. So rocking that pelvis back and forward. And again, seeing if we can do this with an abundance of ease in a range where we're not really tensing through the base of the pelvis. We're not gripping through the bum or the abdominals. We're just letting that pelvis roll back and roll forward. So starting with these pelvic tilts allows us to massage our femoral heads by moving the pelvis around those femoral heads. Just just see if you can make this as easy, as fluid as possible. And then we're going to pause and leave that pelvis in neutral, so in between our two end ranges. And we're going to step the feet wide on the mat, a little bit wider than shoulder width. The arms can come out in a A-frame at our sides. And we're going to tip the knees up and over to the right, allowing that to rotate the pelvis and the spine. And then tip the knees up and over to the second side. So you're allowing the legs to rock from side to side, and that's turning the pelvis as well as turning through the spine. You're keeping the head looking at the ceiling, keeping the shoulders gently connected to the mat as you slowly sway those hips. The next time you tip all the way to one side, pause and feel how the opposite side of your ribs are lifted up off the mat. Use an exhale and pull those ribs back to the mat until you finally come center with the pelvis and legs. Tip in the other direction. Feel how that lifts the opposite side of your ribs off the mat. And then with an exhale, peel those ribs back to the mat, one rib at a time until the knees are at the ceiling. Continue alternating, but focusing on the lifted side of the ribs, and then connect the ribs to pull the legs and pelvis back to center. Use an inhale to tip the legs and pelvis to one side, and an exhale to pull back to center. Feeling how the weight of the legs and the pelvis help to rotate through that thoracic spine, and then using that thoracic spine to help guide you back to center. We'll do one more each side, allowing for that inhale to rotate you. Exhale, come back center. Inhale, rotate, and exhale, come back center. Good. Bring those legs back to hip joint distance apart, and we'll bring those arms up towards the ceiling, and then press the palms together. So sticky hands as though they're gently stuck together with some honey or maple syrup. And then we're going to turn our ribs from side to side. And so it seems easy enough at the start to rotate through that thoracic spine. But we're going to start to add some cues to keep us in a pretty clean thoracic rotation and not spill over to other parts of the body. So while you're rotating through your ribs, through your thoracic spine, you're going to keep the soles of your feet connected on the mat. You're going to keep your knees pointed to the ceiling. You're going to keep your hip points pointed to the sky. And the back of your pelvis is going to stay equally weighted left to right. So we're not turning through the pelvis, we're turning above the belly button for this exercise. You're going to keep both elbows long. So when you're turning to a side, that same side elbow is not allowed to bend. And we're also going to do our best to keep our nose, our thumbs, and the heels of our hands hands lined up with our breastbone as we rotate through that T-spine. Excellent. We'll do one more each side. And then we'll come back center. We'll separate those arms until they're about shoulder distance apart. You're going to take an exhale and feel connected in the back base ribs. And then on your next inhale, arc those arms overhead, keeping the ribs connected at the back. And then bring those arms back in front of the chest. As you inhale, your goal is to stay connected through the back base ribs and simultaneously arc the arms overhead. Chances are the arms won't go all the way over the head in order to keep that back base rib connection. So here we're getting some mobility through the shoulders, but also with that back base rib connection, getting a nice stretch along the sides of our body. We'll do one more here. And then we'll bring ourselves down, arms can rest. Okay, changing our position to a side lie where we'll place a block or a pillow under head so that we can have a little bit of head support. We're going to start with a thoracic mobilizing exercise again. So those arms reaching out in front of the shoulders, in front of the breastbone, and arms resting on the floor, legs stacked, knees bent. And we're going to keep our pelvis and legs relatively still, belly button and hip points aiming forward. And we're going to drag our top arm across the bottom arm and open out to the side. And then we're gonna reverse. So you can have a nice inhale as you open, feel that width across the chest, and then reverse. Making sure that the pelvis isn't coming with you as you try to turn that breastbone towards the ceiling. We'll do one more. And then we'll pause. Have the arms and head resting wherever they're comfortable. And you're going to lengthen out the top leg. And we'll start to lift and lower that leg. So the foot can be relatively relaxed. I know you can't see it on the screen, but we're lifting and lowering that top leg and keeping a little space underneath that bottom waistline. To help keep that space under the bottom waistline, you could take your top hand and place it on your top hip and give that top hip a little reach down toward the end of your mat. Then we're going to hold that leg at about hip height, and we're going to swing the leg forward and press the leg back, keeping that pelvis relatively still, seeing if we can feel the thigh bone rolling in the hip socket. So really work on that stable pelvis and mobile thigh bone. Then pause at hip height. Make sure you've got that little mouse hole under the bottom waistline. And we're going to circle in one direction. And then we'll switch and circle in the other direction. Excellent. Set that leg down. You can give your side hip a little tap, and we're going to make our way to hands and knees for a brief move before we transition to side two. So coming to hands and knees, hands under shoulders, knees under hips, toes tucked, and you're going to round that spine and dip the spine. Let's round from the pelvis up through low back, mid back, neck, head, and then other way. Lift the tail and dip low back, mid back, neck, head. So rounding from the pelvis through the spine and head, and then arching from the pelvis up through the entire spine and then head. One more rounding through the spine, pelvis leads the way. Arching, lead from that pelvis and then spine and head. All right, we'll bring our pillow over to side two. Set up on your side too, however works best in your space. And we'll go for our book openings, stacking our legs, knees pointed forward, hips pointed forward, palms come together, arms reaching out in front of chest. Make sure you've got enough pillow at the back of your head to catch your head as you slide top arm across bottom arm and open. And then reverse. You're keeping your knees pointed forward. You're keeping your hip points and belly button pointed forward. And you're seeing if you can isolate, turning that torso above the pelvis. You can incorporate breath using an inhale to open and an exhale to reverse. Trying to avoid shifting the weight of your pelvis as you go into that open book and that closed book with your arms. Last one. Okay. We go back into our side lying hip series, lengthening out our top leg and starting with that lift and lower, reaching the top hip down towards the end of the mat somewhat in order to keep a lift or a space between the mat and our bottom waistline. And we're keeping that pelvis relatively stable as we move the thigh bone in the socket. So trying to create a sense of which body part is moving, and then mapping that for yourself can be really, really helpful. Leg gets held at hip height and come forward and back and forward and back. A little bit trickier to keep that pelvis stable when the leg is swinging forward and back. You can leave your top hand on the pelvis to monitor somewhat. And there will naturally be a small amount of motion in the pelvis, but you're for the most part keeping that pelvis quite still. Hold at hip height, and we circle that thigh bone in one direction. And then we circle that thigh bone in the second direction. Come down, stack those legs, and you can give that side hip a little tap. And we'll come back to hands and knees, provided that's a productive position for you. Setting up with wrists under shoulders, knees under hips. And this time, the spine is going to stay in its neutral curves as we shift the pelvis back just part way, maybe only a third of the way, and then come forward. And see if you can feel for that pelvis shifting over top of those thigh bones. And see if you can feel those thigh bones gently pressing up into the pelvis. And here, the pelvis and the thigh bones are both moving to a degree, sort of cooperating with one another as we shift that pelvis back and come forward. For 3, and 2, last 1. All right, from here, we make our way up to stand in a way that suits your body. And we're going to end with one standing exercise in order to fire up our glutes a little bit at the end of class. We're going to bend our knees, step 1 foot back, and we've got about 80% of our weight in the front leg. So our back toes, ideally, we're able to float them up fairly effortlessly. That front knee stays bent. We're going to cross our opposite hand over into the front hip crease and put the same side hand of the front leg on the back side, on your back pocket. And from here, you're going to hinge forward, creasing that hip, and then press up, uncrease that hip. So you come forward, and the hip is driving back towards the wall behind you. And you push into the foot, and the hip drives forwards into those fingertips. So you hinge, and it's almost like the fingertips are pushing the hip to the back wall. And then it's like the hip is pushing the fingertips to the front wall. We'll do 2 more, keeping that front knee bent, driving that hip joint back, maybe even giving a gentle press with the fingertips, and then pressing with the hip come forward. Those fingertips gently press into the hip crease, and the hip drives back. You're light in the back leg, and then push with the bum to drive your hip into those fingertips. Ideally, that kickstand hinge feels like quite a lot of work in that glute. So let's give the other side a try. We'll go into a knee bend. We'll establish weight in the front leg on the second side. Kickstand with the back leg. Crossover fingertips into the hip crease. And same side hand on the glute. We really want to feel our glute working here. And as we hinge, we think about pushing our fingertips into the hip crease, and that allows our hip to glide back. And then you could even use your back pocket hand to push the hip forward, and that's what brings us back up. So the fingertips at the front press back, and that drives our hip back. We're light on the back foot. And then the back pocket hand presses our hip forward, and that drives the hip forward. The pacing here is important. And pushing through the floor of your front foot is also important. We'll do 2 more. Pressing with the fingertips, drive that hip back, back, back to the back wall. Then press with the pocket hand, and that hip comes forward. 1 more, press with the fingertips. And the pressing with the fingertips is more of an image than it's actually the fingertips making you hinge. It's not, it's the hip. And same thing on the way up, it's the strength of the hip muscles guiding the hip forward. Come to stand. You can have a little walk about your space and notice how those hips are feeling, your breath is feeling, and maybe how those ribs are feeling as well. Thank you.